Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. If you love this watch, email me directly for pricing. It's in the description below. My email address is tmosso@thewatchbox.com. Reach out to me for pricing of this or any watch you see on any Watchbox platform. Email me at tmosso@thewatchbox.com. Today we're discussing something that is rare even by the standards of exquisite low-volume independent horology. FP Journe makes about 950 watches a year. Back in the early 2000s, it was a few dozen to a few hundred, and yet this is scarce even by those standards, as I'm holding one of the first 6 dozen FP Journe Tourbillon of any description ever made. This is the Tourbillon Remontoir in what is often described as Series 3 configuration. We'll talk about what that means in just a moment, but let's talk about the basic sizing. It is a 38mm watch, and it's the 38mm timepiece with a rose gold case, which proportionally was the minority of the Tourbillon Remontoir production. So by the standards of something already scarce, this is more so. The watch is only 9.4 millimeters thick, 45 millimeters from lug tip to lug tip, with a 20 millimeter spacing between the lugs, meaning on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist, it wears quite nicely. This is a unisex watch. You can absolutely wear this on a wrist as small as 13 centimeters circumference, and it comes nowhere near the edge of my wrist on either side. You can also see it's flat with a domed bezel, so it slides easily underneath the cuff. It's a real power watch for him or for her. It's one of the most important models from one of the most important brands in independent horology, and this example is simply redolent of period character. We'll zoom in real quick, take a look at the strap, which frankly isn't the highlight of the watch, but it's nice to know that you're getting FP Journe factory fabric, small round scale gaiter on the bottom, large rectangular scale gaiter on the top, monotone stitch, olive green with a folded edge, a little bit of bolstering to give it some volume and body, and then you can see there are pull tab spring bars that you can use to remove the strap without tools, plus a matching rose gold FP Journe pin buckle. And you can see they did things differently back then, as there are maker's marks and hallmarks even laterally placed on the case flank. This is something not done on modern FP Journe watches. The timepiece is extraordinarily rare, as you can see that the case year of manufacture, T means tourbillon, 00 is the year 2000. That's the year the case was made, usually very close and proximate to the production of the watch. Remember, the first FP Journe watches built under the Montre Journe nameplate came out in 1999. Those were the Souscription, or Generation 1, or I should say Series 1, Tourbillon Remontoir. This is Series 3. In terms of actual production, not common. The vast majority of the Tourbillon Remontoir are the 4th series of the watch. There were 20, exactly 20 of the first series, maybe 16 to 18 of the second series, and then probably 2 dozen to 4 dozen of the 3rd series, and then they were done with the early watches. Then came the Series 4, which is the volume of production, and in 2004 the transition to the Tourbillon Souverain. So while this does say Tourbillon Souverain on the back, the terminology for this watch in the industry is generally Tourbillon Remontoir. The timepiece features a lot of evocative period elements from FP Journe. You can see the case is what you would expect from any era of Journe, save the unusual hallmarking. Polished in its entirety, domed bezel, a little bit of a lip of the case back in the bezel, defining the mid-case blended and tapered lugs, double dimple knurled style crown, and then the dial. There seem to be 2 versions of dials on these Series 3 watches, very shiny and then less so. I don't believe this to be one of the shinier examples, although you can see it features the somewhat gradiated coloration that's characteristic of these early Journe watches. It doesn't have the appearance of chatoyancy or the impression that the printed features are hovering above the dial. The more heavily varnished examples are very shiny, and they have the look of almost a twin layered setup where the print is hovering over the metal dial base. You can see the metal dial base is a matte finish gold, and then we have black polished, a bezel framing the hours and minutes, a power reserve indicator that goes from 42 to 0. 42 is the power reserve, but like a marine chronometer, the power reserve indicator works backwards. Now you can see the Remontoir system doesn't start jumping. I just turned the crown about half a turn. When you get past 28 hours of power reserve, it activates the constant force device. What you saw at the beginning of the video was just scrolling time. So for 28 hours, you get constant amplitude about the balance because of constant force applied by the Remontoir d'égalité, the system mentioned up at the top of the dial and the namesake of this version of the tourbillon. It was a world first, combining a Remontoir with a tourbillon. Although Lange had done a fusée constant force device, the use of a Remontoir, system invented in the 20th century, with a tourbillon and a wristwatch was FP Journe's great innovation, and his prototype of this watch was created in 1991 using that very system. So this was the first series series production version of that idea. You can see the Remontoir on the reverse side. It's a linear titanium spring, and it ensures that for the first 28 hours of power reserve, the barrel, seen here under the ratchet wheel, it never directly drives the escapement. That allows Journe to achieve constant amplitude, and with that consistency, the watch, which is free-sprung and adjusted in 6 positions, can be tailored very precisely to keep good time. You can't quite see it, but this free-sprung balance also includes a overcoil hairspring made by hand. That helps it to keep even better time in any orientation with respect to gravity, and most of the consistency of this watch as a timekeeper is born of the 6-position adjustment, the free-sprung regulator, the overcoil hairspring, and the Remontoir. FP Journe describes adding a tourbillon to a wristwatch and then including all these other refinements as breaking a leg and then setting it in a cast. But he says the tourbillon is romantic, so it stays. Now, of course, the power reserve indicator moves backwards like a marine chronometer, the idea being to pay homage to many of the great watchmakers and clockmakers who inspired Francois-Paul Journe, as he was a restorationist before he was a watchmaker in his own right, so he has respect for history and the greats. 0 indicates 0 hours since fully wound, and on a marine chronometer, you needed to wind exactly 24 hours apart, so it was more important to know how many hours since the last full winding than how many hours until it was exhausted. Now, as you can see, it's a good-looking watch, but it's not perfect. You can see some of this discoloration around the printing on the dial. That's one manifestation of it, but the closer you get to the components, the more they start to look like a lot of George Daniels watches. Daniels watches were beautiful in an intellectual sense and from a craft standpoint, but they were not perfect the way a modern Patek or Vacheron or Lange is perfect. And this watch is like those Daniels watches. It's more visibly handmade the closer you get, but the important parts are nicely done, and all of it is done with love and dedication. As engine turning on the base plate, you can see black polishing on the Remontoir cock, as well as the half bridge for the tourbillon carriage, a filigree or wire style tourbillon cage with black polished screws, and then that black polished frame surrounding the hobnail guilloche of the concentric minutes and hours, elements that make this a Series 3. You can see there's a larger printing on the power reserve scale that would have been smaller on the first 2 series. The first 2 series would have featured a rounded Remontoir cock. Here we have flat. That's what you would have seen on the 3rd and 4th series watches, as well as the ruthenium watches and the later coffret stainless steel editions. The timepiece, of course, features these large screws. The screws got a lot smaller on the 4th series watches. So when you look at these first 3 series, you see the screws on the dial side are really, really big by FP Journe historic standards. Now, when you turn the watch over, you can see there are more evocative period elements, starting with the incredibly shallow engraving of the case back. You can see it's really not that pronounced. It's almost as though it's been ghosted on prior to engraving. This is how a lot of freehand engravers start their work, with a little bit of a sort of ghosted thin line, and this is actually how these early examples were made. So the engraving gets a lot thicker and deeper on later versions and later tourbillon. You can see it as brass movement era, so this is the era when Journe movements would have been made of brass. That changed in mid-2004, and while gold is more expensive as a commodity, more valuable, I should say, as a commodity, brass is more valuable as a collectible because there are fewer of them. You can see the maker's mark of Eleanor, which was a Paris metropolitan area case maker that made Journe's cases from his early pocket watch days in the early 80s through about mid-2008 when he bought Eleanor and brought it over to Switzerland. As a result, you get the hallmarks of both France and Switzerland on the case. Today, Eleanor is Boîtier de Genève, and it is FP Journe's case factory. You can also see the use of the year of manufacturing for the case. That would have been discontinued. They stopped stamping the case with the year of case manufacture right around mid-2005. The movement, of course, a tourbillon, a Remontoir, a 1-minute tourbillon, a 21.6 beat rate, manual wind, 42-hour power reserve, 25 joules, all of this theoretically water resistant down to 30 meters, but please don't test the theory. If you look, you can see that Holt head screws are used here. Now, the original would have been flathead screws, but at some point this watch went back for service, and what generally happens when they go back for service is that the screws get updated to the current standard. So that's not unusual. That's factory. It's just later factory fitment. This is a timepiece that represents a real investment opportunity. One of the most important watches from one of the most important modern watchmakers, and really one of the foundation stones of the modern independent horology movement. If you're going to own just one Journe, it should probably be a chronomètre, a résonance, or a tourbillon Remontoir. Reach out to me, Tim Mosso, at thewatchbox.com with purchase and pricing details.